So, in the first chapter of the book, I actually discussed what psychedelics are for anybody who is unfamiliar with them. And the word psychedelic itself means something to the effect of like soul manifesting, but I prefer the definition soul illuminating. And the reason they have this connotation is because they can purportedly give a person a window into their own unconscious mind. And it's the capacity to be soul revealing, which sets these drugs, such as LSD, mescaline, psilocybin, and of course DMT, apart from other drugs, such as cocaine and methamphetamine, which are stimulants, and alcohol, which is a depressant. And now, one of the mistakes which people make is the fact that a lot of these drugs are illegal: meth, cocaine, LSD, and many of the psychedelics as well. And so we kind of just lump them all together in the category of bad. These are the harmful drugs. But of course, psychedelics don't have the same potential for harm that other drugs like cocaine, methamphetamine, and heroin do have. But we tend to think of them all as like bad and therefore equally harmful and have equal potential to do harm, when really that's not the case at all. So it's not exactly clear what effects a drug needs to kind of induce to be considered psychedelic. For example, is weed a psychedelic? I'd say in most cases it's not, except in certain contexts and given the right amount, weed can have psychedelic effects. And so it's not always a clear cut matter. Now, there are two main chemical classes into which psychedelics belong. There are other psychedelics and other classes, but the two main ones are the tryptamines and the phenethylamines. And we'll be focusing on the tryptamines, which are named as such because they're essentially modifications of the tryptamine molecule. So this is what a tryptamine molecule looks like. And as you can see, DMT here is just a simple modification of that molecule. Now, a lot of very important biochemicals are tryptamine molecules, such as melatonin and serotonin. Now, serotonin is very important for our discussion because it has multiple functions throughout the body. But in the brain, it's known to bind to receptors which are known as 5-HT receptors. Now, 5-HT is just another way of saying serotonin. It's 5-hydroxytryptamine. But it is believed that psychedelics, which are based on tryptamine, target these receptors. Now, this is one of the reasons why psychedelics don't have the same potential for addiction which other drugs do. Now, to keep in mind that there are some people who do become dependent on psychedelics and feel like they need to take them regularly, but the vast majority of people who take psychedelics will not develop an addiction. And the reason for this is because psychedelics are often utilizing the body's serotonin circuits. And this is in contrast to other drugs, which often release huge surges of dopamine. And dopamine is another important neurotransmitter, which is associated with our reward circuit. So essentially, any activity which releases dopamine, our brains become rewired to repeat that activity. So eating releases dopamine, and that's obviously a behavior that wants to be reinforced, and so your body kind of releases these pleasurable molecules, and then you feel like eating again. But this system can be hijacked if a drug is able to release dopamine artificially. So drugs like methamphetamine, cause these huge surges in dopamine level, and that's why they're so addictive, because essentially it's telling your brain to keep doing this over and over again to keep getting the dopamine. But serotonin isn't like that. It doesn't reinforce behavior. Now, some psychedelics are artificial creations in labs, such as LSD, whereas others occur naturally, such as psilocybin mushrooms. And in most cases, most of the main psychedelics, which we talk about and which are commonly used, have very high LD50 values. So LD50 is the lethal dose required to kill 50% of a population. So it's like a standard test used with medications to determine how dangerous that medication is and how potentially harmful it is. And most psychedelics have extremely high LD50 values. And what this means is that essentially it's almost impossible to overdose on many of the commonly used psychedelics. There are some exceptions. For example, ibogaine is known to be toxic in high doses, but sort of the classic psychedelics like LSD, mushrooms, and DMT, it takes an extremely high amount to be able to overdose on them. Essentially, it would be like trying to overdose on water. Theoretically possible, except you would have to be really trying to kill yourself. It's not something that normally occurs. And so these two facts, the fact that psychedelics are often not addictive, as well as the fact that you're very unlikely to overdose on them, make psychedelics relatively safe compared to other drugs, at least physically speaking. They're not going to cause you any physical harm. Mentally, that's a whole nother topic, and they do have the potential to cause mental harm, but we'll get to that when that comes up. Now, you may be wondering, what do these drugs actually do? And the answer is a little bit complicated. Because they do a lot of things. And each drug is known to feel subjectively different, and even differing doses will kind of expand the range of effects that you can feel. And so it's very hard to sort of generalize, what these drugs do, because each drug is definitely different. Perhaps the most important factor is what is commonly referred to as set and setting. And this is essentially refers to kind of your state of mind going into the experience, the things which have happened to you recently, who you are as a person. These things will affect, the trajectory of the experience and what you will feel and what you'll experience. experience, as well as just your surroundings in general, the people you're around, if they're familiar or unfamiliar, where you're tripping as well. That's the setting. So if you're, it's going to be different if you're in a familiar environment such as your home versus like if you're doing it in a hotel room. The experience will be different just based on that. Generally, when people take these drugs, they're trying to avoid having a negative experience, but it's very difficult to predict the trajectory of the experience. It's often recommended that you're in a familiar environment with people and that somebody's sober so that they can take care of you in case things go wrong. But of course, none of this will be a surefire guarantee that things will go smoothly. So these experiences tend to be kind of unpredictable. Now, in terms of describing what it actually feels like, this is immensely difficult. And to be honest, the only way you're really going to understand it is if you have this experience yourself. But, I can attempt to use metaphorical language to kind of close the gap a little bit, but keep in mind that this isn't a full sort of list of the effects that you will feel. And furthermore, this won't adequately describe what it's actually like, because being in that state of mind is so different from ordinary consciousness that, like, even me in an ordinary state of consciousness right now, I kind of have difficulty even, imagining it back to myself, if you know what I mean. So after consuming a psychedelic, the first thing you may notice are these sort of subtle sensations all around the body, particularly around the skin. And I tend to notice some like in the region of the stomach. And you might be wondering what this is all about. So your body's touch receptors are always kind of experiencing something. So your skin right now is in contact with the air. But there's no point of your brain kind of noticing that and paying attention to that. So it's kind of cognitively filtered out. But when you take psychedelics, it's almost like your touch receptors have been reset so that you begin to feel what the air actually feels like as it touches your skin. Something which is normally, cognitively blocked out, because why would you need to pay attention to that? It's such a trivial thing. And the same thing occurs all throughout your body. So you begin to, it's so eerie because you begin to feel your digestive system operating. You begin to feel food moving through your body. Again, something normally which is filtered out because it's so, there's no point of your brain paying attention to that. It's a waste of energy. And so you begin to feel these things which your body normally filters out and begin to notice these things. This is a very common theme with psychedelics and something that we're going to be getting back to over and over again, where experiences that are cognitively filtered out by your brain because they're deemed, irrelevant, begin to be re-experienced, and you begin to notice things which are otherwise seemingly insignificant. So during these states of mind, the brain becomes very good at recognizing patterns and also noticing the subtle details in everything. For example, you'll be looking at a wall, and if you just look at a wall in your room right now or wherever you are, obviously there's nothing significant about it. But then when you're on psychedelics, you begin to notice every little detail, every little bump and imperfection begins to stand out. And it's almost like the wall becomes alive and just rich with detail. And you'll be thinking to yourself, like, wait, how did I not notice that this wall was so interesting before? It sounds stupid, but it's true. And everything will begin to pop out, and just every little detail will suddenly become super significant. And again, this has to do with the fact that your brain is just getting all of this input, which it normally filters out. And furthermore, the world is filled with a sense of novelty. Any experience which you experience often goes from being novel to being familiar, and so your brain doesn't pay much attention to it. For instance, I live in Canada, so here it always snows at a certain time every year. And when it first snows, everybody's so fascinated by the snow because it's kind of novel. But after a while, it's just like, whatever, nobody cares. But when you take psychedelics, everything begins to appear novel. And even like dumb things like the grass, it's almost like you're re-experiencing it as if it were a brand new object that you'd never seen before. It's almost like being a kid again, because from a kid's perspective, everything is new. They're coming into the world. They haven't experienced these things before. And so everything is exciting and brand new, and everything is novel. Nothing is yet familiar. And so you're kind of experiencing the world as though it were brand new, as though you were coming back into it. And sort of the cognitive categories that we use to simplify the world. So for example, if you look at this car, your brain automatically just tells you it's a car. But one of the ways children, very young children, perceive the world is not necessarily as a world filled with objects, but they kind of just experience the world through their raw perception. So this doesn't look like a car, more or less just looks like a mass of colors. But of course, our brains eventually categorize that object into a car. But it's almost like when you take psychedelics, this categorizing function is loosened. And so things begin to blend into each other, and things don't appear to be discrete objects, but everything seems to be interconnected and woven together. This applies to all stimuli, all sensory stimuli, including auditory and taste. For example, you'll be listening to a song that you knew, or that you thought you knew previously, but it sounds almost like foreign, completely different. And so you can kind of re-experience that song again. And you're also able to pick up more on the details because, again, your brain is kind of working in overdrive, and so you can sort of pick up on the subtle details, which normally you don't pay much attention to. So notice that everything I've said so far isn't necessarily additive. The world stays the same, but your perception of the world becomes different. Hallucinations, however, are something which are additive, which are sort of kind of our mental projections outwards. This usually begins with a heightened ability to detect patterns in your environment. And project sort of mental concepts and mental ideas outwards into the environment. A good example of this would be like if you're looking at clouds with somebody and one of your friends told you that a particular cloud looks like a horse or something. And at first you don't see it, but slowly you can kind of see the image of a horse if you look closely enough, and if you see this kind of different parts of a horse, and then eventually your mind kind of projects the idea of the horse onto the cloud. It's like that, except when you're on psychedelics, this process occurs automatically and with every sort of thing in your environment. So you begin to see all sorts of things on the walls and, on the floor and on the tile patterns, and you begin to connect the dots everywhere and see different types of animals and different types of objects. Even though they're not really there, it's just your mind kind of connecting the dots to make these objects appear. It's similar to like constellations. You know how constellations don't really look like the objects they're supposed to unless you really force your mind to see it. Well, it's like that, except it's kind of happening automatically and with everything in your environment rather than just the stars. And colors and sounds will become more bright and vibrant, and surfaces will begin to appear moving, like they have this kind of wavy quality to them and they're kind of blending into each other. And sometimes the walls will appear to be breathing. That's a very common experience. Sounds will become distorted, where it becomes very hard to recognize individual sounds, and even when people speak, you might not be able to understand exactly what they're saying. And of course, the more you take and the longer the experience lasts, the more intense these hallucinations will become. You may begin to see fractal geometric patterns, such as spinning manual wheels and like with infinite complexity all over the surfaces, and everything just seems to blend together and kind of move in this flowy way, as if there weren't boundaries between individual objects. Like I said before, it's almost like everything is interconnected and interwoven, and there is no separation between individual entities. Everything is just kind of like one. So before I continue on with the subjective experience, it's probably worth asking what's happening in the brain during these psychedelic experiences. And the short answer is we don't exactly know. Just like we don't know what consciousness is in the first place. But we can see the electrical activity of the brain during these states of consciousness. And what it reveals is that the brain is much more active during a psychedelic experience. And different kind of brain regions are communicating with each other in a much faster way. And so that probably explains why you're kind of be able to experience so much of the world so vividly. And another theme which is quite prevalent during psychedelic experiences is the fact of experiencing novelty and unfamiliarity towards things which aren't necessarily unfamiliar. And so it will almost like feel like words begin to lose their meaning because you don't have that sense of recognition every time you hear a word. Words themselves begin to lose meaning, and even familiar places will begin to feel alien and strange. So like a room that you've lived in for your entire life might begin to feel like a place you've never been to before. Now, all of these changes, which I've discussed so far, are kind of things which you perceive externally. But internally, I believe, is where the psychedelic experience is most potent, and that's where things really change. It will begin to feel like your thoughts are racing uncontrollably in all sorts of different directions. One of the common things that I hear is the fact that it feels like more thought ways are opened up, and so you can think more deeply about things and in a more sophisticated manner, and you can kind of get out of the bubble of the normal way you think. And because you can think so deeply about the nature of things, this is why people who are under the influence of psychedelics can feel so enamored just at the sheer fact of existence and the sheer fact of the universe existing, and they can kind of deeply ponder the nature of things, like the distance between stars, and be super mind blown by that, because their brains are able to kind of truly grasp what that means, or at least attempt to grapple with what that means. This is probably one of the reasons why psychedelics have been looked at as a cure for depression, because they enable a person to kind of get out of their unproductive and negative thought patterns, which cause them to spiral into depressive states and depressive states of mind, because they're able to think more flexibly and kind of see their life in a different context. And it's for this reason which psychedelics are able to provide an unparalleled sense of creativity, and not just in the arts. There are probably a huge number of albums and artworks that have been inspired by psychedelics, no doubt, but I also believe that this creativity and this heightened creativity can be applied to other areas as well. So this is why you often hear about in the Silicon Valley people microdosing on psychedelics. I mean, no wonder, because it does seem to provide a huge amount of creativity and a huge amount of flexibility in terms of how you think. Now, keep in mind that this doesn't necessarily mean that you'll think more logically, because these states of mind tend to make you more gullible. So often people will believe very ridiculous things when under the influence of psychedelic, which is probably not a good thing, but at the same time, it does enable you to think differently than from how you normally think. And so that can be a great experience in terms of sort of getting out of your normal systems of thought. So in any case, this state of mind enables a great degree of introspection, to an insane degree where you begin to reflect on everything. And so this is why I think the word psychedelic is appropriate, because what's happening are all of these unconscious thoughts, which your brain kind of picks up on but aren't brought to consciousness, are suddenly rushing forth so that you can experience them with your consciousness. And ideas and memories which you forgot that you completely had will begin to rush up, and you'll begin to experience these things and be able to reflect on your life in a much richer way. And these thoughts sometimes come up, and they sometimes come up a bit forcefully. And also accompanying these thoughts are immensely powerful emotions. People can feel very emotional during psychedelic experiences. Extreme elation, extreme sadness, any emotion that you can experience, but just taken to an extreme pinnacle. This is actually one of the dangers of psychedelics, because if there are thoughts inside your unconscious mind which you don't want to think about, you may try to hold them back because they almost come up automatically and without your conscious direction. And it's the ego's role to kind of hold back thoughts which you don't want to think about. That's kind of how it's able to direct itself and sort of complete very specific goals. But when you're under the influence of psychedelics, these things are just rushing up without your permission. And so, for example, you might begin to think about things which you rather not think about, such as like a past relationship or something that makes you sad and something which you don't want to think about. And yet here it is trying to sort of force its way into your psyche. And so people can kind of have bad experiences when they try to hold these things back, rather than letting them go. And so, this feeling of being overpowered by the unconscious, people who have schizophrenia know it very well. And so it can be a very terrifying thing. And this is one of the big mental dangers of psychedelics. But at the same time, there is potentially something valuable about confronting something which you don't want to confront and which you haven't confronted, and which you haven't sort of taken the time to come to terms with. And so this can be an opportunity to do that. But again, if your ego is intent on sort of preventing that information from coming forth, that could potentially lead you into a bad trip. Another thing which psychedelics do is they seem to increase your empathy by a lot. You begin to feel very empathetic towards others, and you begin to feel more connected with others because you're feeling all these emotions. And so you automatically just project because you begin to, since you're not in your ordinary state of mind, you begin to ponder the possibility of other people experiencing other things which you yourself have not experienced. And so that's why you begin to feel more connected with the world around you, and you begin to feel more empathetic towards other people. Your imagination, in terms of your visual imagery, will be off the charts at this point. So to demonstrate this, you can try to close your eyes right now and imagine what a sunset looks like on a beach. And that image is probably very fleeting, and it's probably not extremely detailed. But psychedelics seem to increase one's ability to imagine things. And so if you try to do that while under the influence of psychedelics, you'll begin to really see it as though it were a vivid landscape. Your mental imagery becomes very detailed. And of course, they also become extremely fantastical and dreamlike. And these are sometimes known as closed eye visuals. And not all of them are voluntary, because sometimes when you close your eyes and then you experience these things, you'll begin to see these rotating geometric patterns. You'll begin to see all sorts of crazy things. You may begin to see individual entities, like the same kind of thing you experience in a dream. When you're in a dream and you experience other people, you may close your eyes and begin to see other people like that, almost like they seem like autonomous entities. And so and many times they're involuntary, so it's not like you're voluntarily bringing these things up. Sometimes you'll just close your eyes and then see these crazy fractal patterns, and it'll be completely automatic. And these visualizations can become extremely alien and extremely scary to look at, especially if your mind concocts something monstrous and terrifying, and something so unfamiliar that your reaction to it is automatically fear. And so again, this is one of the mental dangers of psychedelics, is that they can be quite terrifying because you may encounter something which you didn't expect at all. Now again, I need to emphasize these psychological dangers. I don't want to be overly negative about the potential of psychedelics. They can be very healing, and the experience itself can be very enlightening, but there are mental dangers involved, which is why you need to be cautious. And it seems like the bulk of the mental dangers involved have to do with the fact that everything feels so unfamiliar, and that these thoughts are rushing up that you potentially don't want to have and that you don't want to confront. This is all coupled with the fact that you're in a state of mind where you're very suggestible, so you can easily convince yourself of crazy things which aren't true. For example, you could convince yourself that you're losing your mind, which is actually kind of true because you are losing your mind, at least temporarily, or even crazier things like that there are demons trying to get you, or that your heart is racing uncontrollably, crazy things like that. And then you can easily convince yourself that they're true. This is why people during these states of mind often make very bad decisions, and which is why it's very important to have somebody who's sober who can monitor you and take care of you if something goes wrong, or if you feel anxious. And your emotional state also tends to influence the hallucinations you see. If you look at somebody and you're in a positive state of mind under the influence of psychedelics, you may see them as like this beautiful angel. But if you're in a bad state of mind, you begin to perceive them as like this evil demon. So your emotions affect what you perceive in the environment. And that's true, ordinarily, except with psychedelics, the emotions are so powerful that the that the effect is amplified. And yeah, this can actually get quite scary. People have acquired PTSD from these really traumatizing psychedelic experiences. These are really rare, of course, and the vast majority of people who have negative experiences will be fine afterwards. But you do have to understand that there are dangers involved. So what I was saying before, I guess the sort of culmination of this experience is something which is known as ego death, something which many of you are probably familiar with. And I define ego death as not necessarily a single phenomenon, but a range of phenomena which can vary in intensity. So your ego, as many of you definitely know, is the person who you think you are. And it's kind of yourself in the story of your life. So it's yourself and this kind of narrative which you construct around your life, which makes it possible to be a human, because we all kind of need to place ourselves in this narrative and feel like we're an individual. And it's sort of filled with assumptions about the world and about how things work and about yourself. And it crystallizes around these assumptions so that your ego is not necessarily flexible, and that any information which kind of challenges the ego's assumptions tends to be rejected. But when you take psychedelics, your ability to think is so flexible that whatever assumptions you had, whatever prior assumptions that you may have possessed, begin to crumble. Even the person who you thought you were may begin to dissolve, because you begin to think about yourself more deeply, and sort of the things which the ego normally filters out are just coming up so forcefully that you're sort of forced to reckon with things which you previously didn't consider. And so that's why your ego begins to break and dissolve, and it can culminate in a very tense experience where your ego is completely just not there, and you don't feel like an individual anymore. You just kind of feel like this how do you describe it? Like, you feel like there is no separation between you and your environment, as though that's one of the things the ego does. It creates a barrier between who you perceive yourself to be and the environment around you. But your ego can die to the point where it doesn't feel like you're an individual anymore. It just feels like you are like an aspect of the universe, and you're not any different from the universe around you. Now, this can be a very terrifying experience. It can be a very enlightening experience, and I think that's why most people take psychedelics, to sort of experience the enlightening aspect of this. But if you're not keen on letting your ego die, and you're not willing to accept the possibility of your ego dying, you're going to have a very hard time. As men especially, because at least I believe, because we tend to have very strong egos, and so when we feel our ego dying, our first reaction is nope, I'm just going to keep holding on. But you need to be able to let go, because if you keep holding on, these unconscious contents, they're going to come up anyways. You can't stop them. There's a drug in your brain, and it's affecting your brain, and it's not like you can force the molecule to stop working. And so these things will come up, and you'll have to confront them. And so that's why you need to be able to let your ego die and experience these things, because if you hold on, you're going to have extreme anxiety, especially when this unconscious force is like overpowering you. It can be very frightening, which is why you need to be able to learn how to let go of your ego and just let go in general. And it kind of makes sense as to why you would resist this experience, because the ego doesn't want to die, for the same reason that you don't want to die in general, because obviously death is very scary, and naturally you'd resist death. In a similar way, we don't want to experience ego death because we don't want to experience death in general. But again, like I said before, you really need to be able to learn to let go. Otherwise, of course, if you don't take too much, this probably won't be a problem. But if you do take a high amount, you do have to be ready for the possibility that your ego is going to be destroyed, and that all of the things which you previously believed are going to be shaken to their very core. Now, ego death can be very transformative and very positive, and because it allows you to change your perspective. So if you're a person who gets stuck in these negative thought patterns, as I'm sure many people do, you're able to kind of break that bubble and get beyond yourself and think more flexibly about the world and think differently about the world, and sort of recontextualize your own life in a way which is more positive, potentially more positive. It could be more negative, but this is why psychedelics seem to be very effective tools when treating certain mental health problems. And experiments have shown great success when it comes to treating anxiety, depression, and even certain addictions. Using psychedelics can be very effective in terms of treating the addiction. Smoking addiction, which is very, very difficult to break. It's very difficult to, if any of you smoke, you probably know how difficult it is to quit. But psychedelics seem to kind of change your state of mind to such a degree that it becomes possible to quit. And one of the most interesting examples of this is the drug ibogaine, which has been used very successfully as a way to treat opioid addictions. And so many people today are addicted to opioids, and so many people are dying from opioids. So it's kind of crazy, the fact that ibogaine is not very not commonly available for everybody, even though it's so potentially beneficial for people who are suffering from opioid addiction. It's just nuts. Now, at this point in the book, I sort of give an anthropological account of the history of psychedelics, and I'll briefly touch on the fact that psychedelics have played an immense role in various shamanistic societies, where it's basically used as a form of psychotherapy to kind of deal with the spiritual problems of the tribe. And of course, the shaman himself believes that he is sort of accessing the spirit world through these experiences. And from a psychological point of view, I would say that he's sort of coming into contact with his unconscious mind and dealing with the things which are in there. But of course, fundamentally it's the same experience. Just because you say the spirit world and I say psychology doesn't mean that the experience is any different and that the effect is any different. The outcome is fundamentally is the same. You encounter your unconscious, and because you're able to do that, you're sort of able to confront the things which are lurking there and kind of move past them. Now, despite the fact that psychedelic can be so beneficial in so many ways, the war on drugs of the 70s and 80s arbitrarily decided that psychedelics are just as bad as drugs like crystal meth, cocaine, and heroin, which is just crazy to think about because obviously they're not. It's basically impossible to overdose on LSD, and you're very unlikely to develop an addiction to any of these drugs. And yet they're considered to be more or less as dangerous as these other drugs, which you can overdose on and which you can be very addicted to. Another consequence of the fact that these drugs are illegal is that it makes research on these drugs very difficult to conduct, and so their potential benefits aren't being explored to a great degree. But thankfully, recently, this has begun to change. There has been something of a psychedelic renaissance in recent years, and which some of you are probably familiar with, in which there's more support for psychedelics and sort of more opening up of the research lanes. Obviously, this experience isn't for everybody, and I can't necessarily recommend that you take psychedelics because, there's the potential dangers, and of course, there's the legal ramifications, which are very serious. It's completely crazy that people can face prison time for taking psychedelics, but it is a reality. It is a massive risk if you decide to take these drugs yourself. Of course, that not to mention the psychological dangers. But of course, there are ways to mitigate the psychological dangers, and I don't want to necessarily discourage anybody from taking these drugs. I don't necessarily recommend it, but at the same time, if I do believe that adults should be able to make their own decisions regarding these matters. So this has been an introduction to what psychedelics actually are, and you might be wondering, what does this have to do with the theories that I was discussing in the other video? And this has to do what the theory has to do with DMT. So everything which I discussed about psychedelics, it is a very difficult experience to explain in words, but it's possible to explain it in words. The DMT experience, however, is not like that. And it's not necessarily the DMT experience itself, it's more of the breakthrough experience. So when you take a certain amount, something happens when you take a certain amount, which is so different from everything which I described before that it makes you wonder what's really going on and where consciousness actually comes from. And so in the next chapter, I'll be discussing DMT, the history of DMT, and what DMT actually is. So look forward to that. But anyways, thanks for watching, and stay safe when doing anything dangerous, including but not limited to the consumption of mind-altering substances. Take care.